Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. Election Day is just about 2 weeks away on this Sunday morning. And in this pandemic year, thousands of Granite Staters are already casting their ballots. This morning, we're going to be hearing from the major party candidates for U.S. Senate, and we'll get things started right away with the incumbent, Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Good morning.
So you said you're not going to support Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation to the Supreme Court. That would make you 3 for 3 now on opposing President Trump's nominations to the highest court in the land. Is it safe to say you're not going to vote for another Republican president Supreme Court pick? And if not, what would prompt you to back down at this point?
No, I would vote for a Supreme Court pick who I believe would uphold the Constitution and uphold precedent that has already been set. And what we've heard from Amy Coney Barrett is that not only does she question the need for the Supreme Court to stand by precedent, but she's already indicated that she believes the Affordable Care Act should be overturned. She has questioned Roe v. Wade and the ability of women to make their own choices on their reproductive health. In her hearings, she questioned whether Medicare was constitutional. She has extreme views, and that was my concern about Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch as well. So it's more about how the justice would address major issues that are of importance to the American people than about whether they're being nominated by a Republican or a Democrat.
Balance of power on the Supreme Court is going to be shifting. It's possible the same thing could be happening after November 3rd in the White House and the U.S. Senate as well. We know you're opposed to adding seats to the Supreme Court, but what about the body you serve in, the U.S. Senate? The House has already approved statehood for Washington, D.C., and you've signed on to a bill in the Senate that would do the same. Would you support fast-tracking D.C. statehood in 2021 to ensure that 2 additional senators would be elected in 2022?
Well, the legislation, and I have supported this legislation in the past, it not only addressed statehood for Washington, D.C., but it also added seats in red states so that there would be a balance, so that the bill wouldn't provide an automatic immediate benefit to either Republicans or Democrats. I think that's the way we need to look at this issue. And so I think Washington, D.C. should have statehood.
Not to get too far into the weeds here, but the Constitution does provide for congressional power over the district. Specifically, the worry was that if a state controlled the federal capital, that there could be problems essentially there. So how do you get around the fact that the Constitution says that Congress has to control the federal seat of power?
Well, one of the things that we've seen with Washington, D.C. is that it's very much been used as a whipping boy, a whipping post for particular issues by my Republican colleagues. In the time that I've been in the Senate, there has been an effort to prevent Washington, D.C. from making their own decisions on issues like Roe v. Wade, on issues of guns, on a whole range of issues. And I don't think that's the role that our founding fathers and mothers envisioned for the Capitol when they wrote the Constitution.
What about Puerto Rico? They actually have a non-binding referendum on November 3rd on their own statehood, so they're going to be weighing in, and this could very well be before the next Congress. Would you be a yes vote for Puerto Rican statehood?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on that, Adam. I think if Puerto Rico decides they would like to be considered for statehood, that's something that we should take up in Congress and make a decision at that point.
There's likely to be some move in 2021 as well if Democrats control the Senate to codify Roe v. Wade, the abortion rights issue. Will there be any restrictions, do you believe, in that federal law that you would support on abortion?
Well, there are restrictions in Roe v. Wade as it was decided by the Supreme Court. I think that has worked pretty well for decades, and I would certainly think what we do would mirror what the court has upheld.
On health care, the Supreme Court could also be striking down part or all of the Affordable Care Act in the years to come. What is the replacement? Would you just go and push Obamacare 2.0, or would it be something different?
Well, you know, that's the frustrating thing, Adam. We've heard from my Republican opponent, from Republicans in the Senate, from the Trump administration, that they want to overturn the Affordable Care Act, that they have a better plan. And yet we haven't seen that plan. Donald Trump's been in office for 4 years. The first 2 years in 2017 and 18, Republicans controlled the White House, the House, and the Senate. And we never saw a plan during that time. When the Congress voted not to repeal the Affordable Care Act, there was no backup plan from Republicans. We haven't heard from my opponent what his plan is. He talks about these, broad guidelines, but what he's talking about is what we had for the Affordable Care before the Affordable Care Act. It's what we had when people with pre-existing conditions couldn't get health care, when pregnant women couldn't get health care because that was considered a pre-existing condition and they had to pay more. Before, when we didn't have essential health benefits that said that insurance companies have to do certain things if you have insurance with them to make sure that people can get the care they need. Insurance companies were able to set caps on what they were willing to pay to cover people who had health care issues. I don't think people want to go back to that time. I think what we need to look at is how we improve the Affordable Care Act. That's what I've tried to do in my years in the Senate. I think we need to look at how we can get people to be allowed to buy into Medicare or Medicaid, how we set up a public option so that we can expand coverage for people, because we need to not only expand coverage, but we also need to address cost. And I have a number of pieces of legislation that would increase the subsidies that are available to people to help both small businesses cover their employees and to help individuals.
Interested in your perspective on some new litigation that's popped up in the state around voting rights. If a college student has attended a college or university in New Hampshire in person, but they're currently now remote at home in another state, should they be allowed to vote in this November 3rd election here in New Hampshire?
No, I was a co-sponsor of the state's same-day voter registration law back when I was in the state Senate. And the goal of that law was to expand the ability of people to be able to vote. What our system is designed to do, what a democracy is designed to do, is ensure that people have an opportunity to participate in it. That's my goal. Students, if they go to UNH and they're able to vote here, I think that's okay. They should not vote then if they live in another state. So that's the whole point. You vote once, and you vote if you voted in New Hampshire before, you should be able to vote here again if you're registered here. And for students who are registered here, they ought to be able to vote here.
Even though the domicile would appear to be somewhere else? I mean, if they're physically living in another state, it seems the connection would be a little bit tenuous by campus.
Well, again, what we saw when Governor Sununu and the Republican legislature changed the definition of domicile 2 years ago. It was very directly an effort to prevent students from voting. What we heard from Governor Sununu at the time was, when he signed the bill, he said, if we had had this legislation in place, Senator Ayotte would still be in office. She would still be our senator. It was designed because they understood that students, when they're allowed to vote in New Hampshire, when they go to school here, that they often vote Democratic. And they should be allowed to vote wherever they are. And if students find it easier to vote here because they voted here before, they're registered here, they should be allowed to vote here. Just like members of the military who may be serving someplace else in the country, but if they're registered here, if this is their residence, they should be able to vote here.
On police reform, you've opposed stripping police officers of their qualified immunity from civil lawsuits, even though your delegation colleagues, Congresswoman Custer and Congressman Pappas, voted in favor of that. Why do you think it's a mistake to take that legal shield away from officers?
Well, I was proud to be endorsed last week by the state police. And one of the things we talked about when they announced that endorsement is the importance of being able to recruit and retain people in law enforcement. And that's one of the concerns about taking away qualified immunity. Now, we do need to hold police officers accountable for their actions. And I think what the State Commission recommended in setting up a separate entity to do that outside of police departments that could have an objective review is very important. We do need to hold police officers accountable for their actions.
Your campaign has been very critical of your opponent's law firm, Messner Reeves, and cases taken on by that firm. Do you think that any law firm stands up to that scrutiny, though? I mean, your husband owns a law firm. Sometimes people and clients are unsavory, especially in the world of criminal defense. People are entitled to representation, so that kind of happens. So what is it, in your opinion, that makes Messner Reeves any different than any other law firm?
Well, I'm not sure they are any different, except that one of the things that they have done is to advertise their expertise in helping companies in China. And they represented a Chinese government-backed company against a U.S. manufacturing company. And so I think there are real questions about whether that should happen. I certainly don't support that. And when he was asked about it, what my opponent said was, well, that was before I was running for the Senate. Well, if it's wrong since he's running for the Senate, it should have been wrong before then. So I do think I would hope that there are certain clients and certain issues that law firms would say, I'm not going to represent this issue.
All right, Senator Shaheen, thank you for joining us this morning on Close Up. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail in the home stretch.
Great.